The small log cabin sat alone at the edge of the valley, smoke curling from its stone chimney into the clear blue sky. 12-year-old Annie swept the wooden porch, her faded blue dress patched at the elbows and knees. The missionary outpost wasn't much, just 3 buildings and a garden plot, but it had been her home since the fever took her parents 2 winters ago. "Annie, have you gathered the eggs yet?" called Mrs. Bishop from inside the cabin. "Not yet, ma'am. I'm just finishing the sweeping," Annie replied, quickening her strokes with the broom made of bound twigs. Life at the frontier outpost followed the same pattern each day. Up before sunrise, chores until midday, lessons with Reverend Bishop in the afternoon, and more chores until sunset prayers. The Bishops were kind enough folks, but they had their hands full running the outpost, teaching the few settler children who lived nearby, and trying to bring their faith to this wild corner of the Montana Territory. The summer of 1858 had been unusually hot and dry. Dust coated everything, and the creek that ran near the outpost had shrunk to a trickle. The big river was a half-hour walk through the woods, still flowing strong from the mountain snowmelt, but Mrs. Bishop had forbidden Annie from going there alone. "Too dangerous," she said, "not just the deep water and strong currents, but because of the Shoshone people whose lands lay across the river." Annie had seen them sometimes, watching from the tree line. The adults at the outpost spoke in hushed, worried tones about the natives and those Indians, especially since word had spread about trouble at other settlements. But Annie couldn't help feeling curious. The glimpses she'd caught of their colorful clothing, the way they moved like shadows through the forest. It seemed magical to a girl whose world had become so small and predictable. "Those eggs won't gather themselves." "Child," Mrs. Bishop said, appearing at the door with hands on her hips, flour dusting her apron. "Yes, ma'am. Going right now." The chicken coop stood behind the cabin, and Annie ducked inside, breathing in the warm, musty smell of hay and feathers. She collected 6 brown eggs in her apron, careful not to break any. 1 egg would cost her a supper, and she was always hungry these days. "Growing like a weed," Reverend Bishop would say, ruffling her sandy brown hair. After delivering the eggs, Annie was sent to collect firewood from the pile near the garden. As she stacked the split logs in her arms, she noticed dark clouds gathering over the mountains. Another summer storm coming. They'd had 3 this month already, each bringing thunder and lightning but barely any rain, just enough to make the air sticky without easing the drought. "Think we'll get real rain this time?" she asked Reverend Bishop as he mended a fence post. He looked up at the sky, squinting his eyes against the sun. "The Lord provides what we need when we need it, Annie, though I admit some rain would be mighty welcome for the garden." The Reverend was tall and thin, with a beard that reached the middle of his chest. He wasn't as stern as Mrs. Bishop, sometimes even telling stories by the fire in the evenings. Stories about places far away, with buildings taller than trees and carriages that moved without horses. Annie wasn't sure she believed all his tales, but they helped her imagine a world beyond the outpost. "Reverend," she said, shifting the weight of the wood in her arms, "why don't we try talking to the Shoshone people? Maybe they could teach us things like how they find food when it's so dry." The Reverend's face grew serious. "It's complicated, child. There's been trouble with other tribes further east. The army's been called in at Fort Laramie. Best we keep to ourselves for now." Annie nodded but didn't really understand. If people were hungry on both sides of the river, wouldn't it make sense to help each other? After supper that evening, a thin stew with more broth than vegetables, Annie sat on the porch steps watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. The storm clouds had moved closer, and a cool breeze brought the smell of rain. In the distance, she heard the low rumble of thunder. "Storm's coming," said Mrs. Bishop, joining her on the steps. "Might be a big one." "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Bishop wasn't one for idle conversation. But tonight she seemed different, almost nervous as she looked toward the darkening forest. "Annie," she said finally, "I need you to promise me something. With this weather coming and the Reverend riding out tomorrow to visit the Henderson family, I need you to stay close to the cabin. No wandering, you hear? But what about my chores? I need to fetch water and we'll manage. There's been word from travelers that more soldiers are coming through. And where there's soldiers, there's trouble with the natives. Just stay where I can see you tomorrow." Annie nodded slowly. Mrs. Bishop rarely showed concern like this. Something was happening that the adults weren't saying out loud. That night, Annie couldn't sleep. The storm had arrived, lightning flashing through the small window of her loft room, thunder shaking the cabin walls. Between the crashes, she thought she heard something else. Horses, maybe. Men's voices. She crept to the window but could see nothing in the darkness. Morning came with surprising brightness. The storm had passed, leaving puddles in the yard and a fresh, clean smell in the air. Reverend Bishop saddled his horse early, packing supplies for his journey to the Henderson homestead, where a new baby had arrived. "I'll be back by tomorrow evening," he told Mrs. Bishop, kissing her cheek. "Keep the rifle loaded just in case." Annie pretended not to hear as she fed the chickens. Just in case of what? With the Reverend gone, Mrs. Bishop seemed even more on edge. She jumped at sounds from the forest and kept the cabin door locked, which they never did during daylight. By midday, the summer heat had returned, drying the puddles and turning the brief relief from the storm into a memory. Mrs. Bishop had a headache and went to lie down, making Annie promise again to stay near the cabin. But sitting on the porch, mending a torn shirt, Annie saw something moving at the edge of the forest. Not the wind in the trees, but something deliberate. She squinted against the sun. There, a flash of color between the pines. Someone was watching the outpost. Annie glanced at the cabin door. Mrs. Bishop was resting. No one would know if she took a quick look. Just to the edge of the trees and back, heart pounding, she set down her sewing and walked casually toward the garden. Then, when she was out of view from the cabin windows, she broke into a run, heading for the tree line. The forest welcomed her with cool shade and the sharp smell of pine. Annie moved quietly, stepping over fallen branches, alert for any sound. The woods were strangely silent. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering. Then she saw it. A scrap of bright blue cloth caught on a bush. She reached out, touching the soft material. Unlike anything the settlers wore, it was decorated with tiny shell beads and what looked like porcupine quills dyed yellow and red. A twig snapped behind her. Annie spun around, her heart in her throat. Nothing was there, but the forest suddenly felt different, as if 100 eyes were watching her from the shadows. The silence deepened, pressing against her ears. Annie backed away slowly, clutching the scrap of cloth. She needed to return to the cabin before Mrs. Bishop woke up. As she turned to leave, something caught her eye. A thin column of smoke rising from deeper in the forest in the direction of the river. A campfire? Travelers, maybe? Or the realization hit her like a splash of cold water. The Shoshone were closer than usual, probably camped by the river. That's why the Reverend and Mrs. Bishop were worried. That's why they wanted her to stay close. Annie should have run straight back to the cabin. That would have been the sensible thing to do. Instead, curiosity pulled her forward toward the smoke, toward the river. Just a quick look, she told herself. Just to see. She didn't know then that this decision would change everything. Didn't know that by tomorrow's dawn, her entire world would be turned upside down. For now, she was just a lonely girl, drawn to the mystery waiting in the forest, unaware that fate had already set her path toward an extraordinary encounter. Annie moved deeper into the forest, her worn boots making little sound on the pine needle floor. The thin trail of smoke she'd spotted guided her forward like an invisible thread. She knew she was breaking her promise to Mrs. Bishop, but something stronger than obedience pulled her toward the river. The forest grew thicker as she walked, sunlight filtering through the branches in dappled patterns. Birds had gone quiet, and even the insects seemed to be holding their breath. Annie paused every few steps to listen, her heart thumping so loudly she was sure anyone nearby could hear it. After 15 minutes of careful walking, the trees began to thin, and she could hear the rush of the river ahead. The smoke was clearer now, rising just beyond the tree line. Annie crouched behind a fallen log, peering through a gap in the branches. The sight before her stole her breath away. The river stretched wide and powerful, its surface glittering in the afternoon sun. On the rocky shore, not 20 steps from where Annie hid, was a girl about her own age. But this was no settler child. The girl wore a fringed buckskin dress decorated with colorful beadwork. Her long black hair was braided with strips of red cloth, and around her neck hung a necklace of polished stones. She was a Shoshone, one of the people the Reverend had warned Annie about. But something was wrong. The girl sat on a rock, bent over her right ankle, her face twisted in pain. Beside her, a small fire sent up the thin column of smoke Annie had followed. A basket lay overturned nearby, berries scattered across the stones. As Annie watched, the Shoshone girl tried to stand, putting weight on her injured foot. She immediately fell back with a cry of pain, tears streaming down her face. She looked around desperately as if hoping for help, but she was alone. Annie's mind raced. The girl was hurt and couldn't walk. The river was too wide and swift to cross alone, especially with an injury, and judging by the position of the sun, evening was approaching. Soon it would be dark. Every warning Annie had ever heard echoed in her head. Don't go near the natives. They're dangerous. Stay away from the river. Come straight back to the cabin. But the girl looked so small sitting there alone, so afraid. Before Annie could change her mind, she stood up from behind the log. The Shoshone girl spotted her instantly, eyes widening in fear. She scrambled backward, wincing as her injured ankle dragged across the ground. She reached for something at her waist, a small knife, and held it out with shaking hands. Annie raised her palms to show she carried no weapons. "It's okay," she said softly, though she knew the girl probably couldn't understand her words. "I won't hurt you." She took a step forward, then another. The Shoshone girl watched her warily, knife still raised. Annie pointed to the girl's ankle, then to herself, miming that she wanted to help. The girl's eyes narrowed in suspicion, but she didn't back away further. Slowly, Annie approached until she stood just a few feet from the girl. Up close, she could see the swelling around the ankle, already turning purple against the girl's copper skin. "I'm Annie," she said, touching her chest. Then she pointed to the injured girl with a questioning look. For a long moment, the Shoshone girl said nothing. Then she lowered her knife slightly. "Conti," she said, touching her own chest. Annie smiled. A name. That was a start. She knelt beside Conti, gesturing toward the injured ankle. "May I?" she asked, miming, looking at the injury. After a moment's hesitation, Conti nodded, though she kept her knife close. Annie gently examined the swollen ankle. It wasn't broken. She'd seen enough farm accidents to know what a broken bone looked like, but it was badly sprained. Conti wouldn't be walking on it anytime soon. "You need cold water and bandages," Annie said, more to herself than to Conti. She looked around, spotting a strip of cloth tied to Conti's basket. "Can I use this?" She mimed, tearing the cloth and wrapping it around Conti's ankle. After a moment, Conti nodded again, her dark eyes still wary but with something else now. Hope. Annie tore the cloth into strips, then went to the river's edge. She soaked one strip in the cold water and returned to press it against the swelling. Conti flinched at first, then relaxed as the cold numbed the pain. As Annie worked, she noticed Conti glancing anxiously across the river. Following her gaze, Annie could just make out wisps of smoke rising from beyond the far shore, a village hidden among the trees. "That's your home?" Annie asked, pointing. Conti nodded, saying something in her own language while gesturing at the sun, then pointing to where it would set. Annie understood. Conti needed to be home by nightfall, but how? The nearest crossing was miles downstream, and even then it would be dangerous. And Conti couldn't walk, let alone swim the swift current. Annie bit her lip, thinking, if she helped Conti get home, she would be gone for hours, maybe all night. Mrs. Bishop would be frantic. She might even send for the Reverend to come back early. There would be terrible trouble. But looking at Conti's face, the fear beneath the brave expression, Annie couldn't just leave her here. "Wait here," Annie said, holding up a hand. "I'll be right back." She hurried into the woods, searching for fallen branches. She found two that were relatively straight and sturdy, about as tall as her shoulder. These would make decent walking sticks. Then she spotted a patch of soft moss growing on a fallen tree, perfect for padding. When she returned to the shore, Conti was attempting to stand again, using a rock for support. Annie quickly showed her the branches, demonstrating how to use them as crutches with the moss padded under her arms. It took some trial and error, but soon Conti was standing, balancing on her good foot with the makeshift crutches supporting her weight. She said something in her language, her voice warm with gratitude. Annie smiled, then her face grew serious as she looked at the wide river. Even with crutches, how would they cross? She remembered a place about a quarter-mile downstream where the river narrowed and several large rocks created a partial bridge across the water. She'd discovered it during her explorations but had never dared cross. The gaps between the rocks were still wide, and the current strong enough to sweep away anyone who slipped. It was dangerous, but it might be their only chance. Annie pointed downstream, miming walking, then hopping from rock to rock. Conti watched intently, then nodded her understanding. Together they began making their way along the shore. Progress was slow. Conti struggled with the crutches on the uneven ground, sometimes needing to lean on Annie's shoulder. The sun dipped lower in the sky, shadows lengthening across the water. Annie tried not to think about Mrs. Bishop, who had surely discovered her absence by now. She focused instead on helping Conti navigate the rocky shore, pointing out routes that might trip her, steadying her when she stumbled. As they walked, something unexpected happened. Conti began pointing to plants along the way, saying words in her language. Annie realized she was naming them, perhaps teaching her, or simply making conversation in the only way they could. Annie smiled and repeated the words, probably mangling the pronunciation, which made Conti laugh despite her pain. In return, Annie would point and say the English names. Pine tree, blackberry eagle. By the time they reached the narrowing in the river, they had exchanged dozens of words. Annie felt a strange connection forming between them, bridging the gap their different languages created. But now came the hard part. The crossing. The river roared between the rocks, white water churning around their bases. The first gap was about 3 feet wide, manageable for Annie alone, but nearly impossible for Conti with her injured ankle. Annie stared at the rushing water, doubt creeping in. Had she made a terrible mistake bringing them here? What if one of them fell in? She looked at Conti, expecting to see fear. Instead, she found determination in the girl's eyes. Conti pointed to herself, then to the far shore and nodded firmly. She wanted to try. Annie took a deep breath. There was no turning back now. The sun was already touching the mountaintops. Soon it would be dark, and crossing would become impossible. Together, Annie said, pointing to both of them, then to the river. We'll do this together. The rushing water seemed louder now as Annie studied the scattered rocks that formed their makeshift bridge. She'd never tried crossing here before, only watched from the shore, imagining herself brave enough to make the leap from stone to stone. Now there was no time for imagination. The sun was sinking, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I'll go first, Annie said to Conti, miming her plan. Annie stepped onto the first rock, testing it with her weight. It was sturdy, though slippery with spray from the river. She carefully moved to the edge, judging the distance to the second rock. It was a jump, but manageable. With a deep breath, she leapt, landing solidly on the second stone. She turned back to Conti with a smile, trying to look more confident than she felt. Now came the tricky part. Conti couldn't jump with her injured ankle. She would need help. Annie pointed to Conti's makeshift crutches, then made a throwing motion. Conti understood immediately. She tossed the first crutch across to Annie, who caught it easily. The second followed. Next, Annie stretched her arm out toward Conti, showing she would help pull her across. Conti nodded, her face set with determination despite the fear in her eyes. She scooted to the edge of the shore, her injured foot held carefully above the ground. Annie braced herself on the rock, one hand clutching a small notch for balance, the other extended toward Conti. Their fingers were still inches apart. You'll have to push off with your good foot, Annie said, demonstrating with her hand. Conti bit her lip, then nodded. She placed her good foot firmly against a rock at the water's edge. Then, with a sudden push, she launched herself forward, arms outstretched. For a heart-stopping moment, Annie thought Conti wouldn't make it. Then their hands connected and Annie pulled with all her strength. Conti landed on the rock beside her, wobbling dangerously close to the edge before Annie steadied her. They stood together on the stone, barely enough room for them both, the current rushing around them. Conti's eyes were wide, but there was a flash of triumph in them. The first step was complete. Annie handed Conti one of the crutches to help her balance, keeping the other for the next rock. This time, Annie would jump first, then help Conti across by extending the second crutch for her to grab. Rock by rock, they made their way across the river. Each leap was a challenge. Twice Annie's foot slipped on the wet stone, and once Conti nearly fell when her crutch slid on a patch of moss. But each time they recovered, working together with a wordless understanding that grew stronger with each successful jump. The sun dipped lower. The shadows lengthened, and still they were only halfway across. The next gap was the widest yet, nearly 5 feet of churning water between two flat stones. Annie studied it, her stomach nodding. It was too far for Conti to jump, even with help. We need to think of something else, Annie muttered, scanning the river. About 20 feet downstream, a fallen tree stretched partway into the water. It wasn't a bridge, but it might bring them closer to the far bank. Annie pointed to the log, miming her new plan to Conti, They would backtrack to shore, make their way to the fallen tree, then use it to get as far as possible before attempting the final crossing. Conti looked at the darkening sky, then nodded quickly. They carefully made their way back to shore, then followed the bank to the fallen tree. The old pine stretched about 30 feet into the river before disappearing beneath the surface. Its bark was rough and peeling, but the trunk was wide enough to walk on if they were careful. Annie went first again, balancing with her arms outstretched. The trunk swayed slightly under her weight, but it held firm. She turned and offered her hand to Conti. With one crutch for balance and Annie's hand for support, Conti stepped onto the log. Together they inched their way forward, the river rushing beneath them, spray dampening their clothes. They were making good progress when Annie heard a crack. The sound froze her in place. The log shifted beneath them, dipping slightly toward the water. "We need to hurry," Annie said, her voice tight. They moved faster now, less careful but more desperate. The far end of the log was sinking, water already washing over its surface. They were still 15 feet from where it disappeared into the river, and at least 10 feet from the opposite shore. Another loud crack. The log lurched. Conti lost her balance, her crutch tumbling into the water. Annie grabbed her arm just in time, keeping them both on the increasingly unstable trunk. "We have to jump," Annie shouted over the roar of the water. Now, the shore was still too far. But a few feet away, in the direction of the current, was a small island. Really just a mound of earth and rocks with a few scrubby bushes clinging to its surface. It was their only chance. Annie pointed to the island, then held up 3 fingers, counting down. 3, 2, 1. They jumped together, Conti clinging to Annie's arm. For a suspended moment, they were flying over the rushing water. Then they hit the island hard, rolling in the mud and gravel. Annie felt a sharp pain in her knee as it struck a rock, but she ignored it. They were alive. They had made it to the island. Behind them, with a final groan of splintering wood, the log gave way, carried downstream by the current. Their bridge was gone. Conti said something in her language, her voice shaky but with a note of relief. Annie didn't need to understand the words to know what she meant. That was too close. They sat together on the small island, catching their breath. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the mountains, the sky darkening to deep blue. Soon it would be night. Annie looked around their tiny refuge. The island was maybe 15 feet across at its widest point, with a few stunted bushes and a single young pine tree growing from its center. From here to the far shore, Conti's side, was about 20 feet of swift water. To return to the missionary outpost side would be even farther. Maybe 30 feet. They were stranded. "We'll have to wait until morning," Annie said, knowing Conti couldn't understand the words but hoping she would understand their situation. Conti looked at the darkening sky, then across the water toward her village. She spoke softly, her words carrying a tone of resignation mixed with worry. The temperature was dropping quickly as the sun disappeared. Their clothes were damp from the river spray, and the wind was picking up. Annie shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. Conti watched her for a moment, then reached into a small pouch tied at her waist. She pulled out a flint and a small curved piece of metal. Then she gestured to the bushes, miming breaking off branches. Annie understood. They would need a fire to survive the night. Working together, they gathered what dry material they could find on the tiny island. Dead branches from the bushes, pine needles, a few tufts of dried grass. Annie arranged them in a small pile, while Conti struck her flint against the metal, creating sparks. It took several attempts, but finally a spark caught in the dry pine needles. Conti bent low, gently blowing on the tiny flame until it grew, catching the smaller twigs. Soon they had a small but steady fire. They sat close to the flames, the island otherwise dark now except for the stars appearing overhead and the faint glow of fires from Conti's village across the river. Annie wondered if they were looking for Conti. She wondered if Mrs. Bishop was looking for her. Conti reached into her pouch again and pulled out a handful of dried berries. She offered some to Annie, who took them gratefully. They were tart but sweet, easing her growing hunger. As they ate, Conti began to speak softly. Though Annie couldn't understand the words, she sensed Conti was telling her something important. Conti pointed to herself, then made a swooping motion with her hand before pointing to her injured ankle. "You fell?" Annie asked, miming the action. Conti nodded, then continued her story with gestures and words. She had been gathering berries alone, had climbed a tree to reach some and fallen. She'd managed to make it to the river, hoping to cross back to her village when the pain became too much. "I'm glad I found you," Annie said simply. They fed the fire with their limited supply of wood, knowing they needed to make it last through the night. The island was exposed to the wind coming down from the mountains, and the air grew colder with each passing hour. To stay warm, they huddled close together beside the fire, strangers that morning now dependent on each other for survival. "Tomorrow," Annie said, pointing to the eastern horizon where the sun would rise, then to the far shore. "We'll get you home tomorrow." Conti seemed to understand. She nodded, then surprised Annie by reaching over and squeezing her hand briefly, a simple gesture of trust and gratitude that needed no translation. Under the vast starry sky, on a tiny island in the middle of a river that divided two worlds, an unlikely friendship had begun to form. Annie woke to the first gray light of dawn seeping into the sky. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was. Then she felt the hard ground beneath her, smelled the smoky remains of their small fire, and heard the constant rush of the river around their tiny island. Beside her, Conti still slept, her face peaceful despite the uncomfortable bed of earth and stones. During the night, they had huddled close for warmth, two girls from different worlds finding common ground in their shared need for survival. Annie sat up carefully, wincing at the stiffness in her joints. Her dress was still damp in places and her stomach growled with hunger. She looked across the water toward the far shore, Conti's home. In the growing light, Annie could make out the distant shapes of the Shoshone village. Smoke rose from several fires, and she thought she could see movement. People beginning their day, perhaps wondering about the missing girl. Then Annie glanced back toward the missionary outpost side of the river. Her heart sank. Mrs. Bishop must be frantic by now. The Reverend might even have returned early to help search for her. There would be terrible consequences when she finally made it back. If she made it back. The problem of crossing the remaining stretch of river still loomed before them. Conti stirred beside her, opening her eyes to the new day. She sat up, immediately checking her injured ankle. The swelling had gone down somewhat, but it was still clearly painful when she tried to move it. "Morning," Annie said softly. Conti replied in her own language, something that sounded like a greeting. Then she pointed to the far shore, a question in her eyes. Annie nodded. Somehow they needed to cross the remaining distance today. They shared the last of Conti's dried berries for breakfast, washing them down with river water cupped in their hands. Then they studied their surroundings with fresh eyes, looking for a way forward. The island where they had spent the night was closer to Conti's side of the river than to Annie's, but the water still ran swift and deep between them and safety. Without wood for a raft or rope for support, swimming would be dangerous, especially with Conti's injury. Annie walked the perimeter of the small island, searching for inspiration. Near the downstream edge, she noticed something promising, a line of partially submerged rocks extending toward the far shore. Most were underwater, visible only as disturbances in the current, but a few broke the surface. She called Conti over and pointed out her discovery. If they were careful, they might be able to use these rocks as stepping stones. Wading through the shallower sections, it would mean getting wet, perhaps even swimming briefly in the deeper parts, but it seemed their best chance. Conti studied the water, then nodded firmly. She untied the leather strips that held her moccasins and tucked them into her waist pouch to keep them dry. Annie removed her boots and woolen stockings, setting them aside on a rock. The morning air was cool against her bare feet. They decided Annie would go first again, testing the depth and current. If it seemed safe, she would help Conti across. Taking a deep breath, Annie stepped into the river. The cold hit her like a slap, stealing her breath for a moment. The water came to her knees, the current tugging at her dress, trying to pull her off balance. She planted her feet carefully on the slippery river bottom, feeling for stable footing before taking each step. The first submerged rock was about 5 feet away. Annie shuffled toward it, fighting the current. When she reached it, the water had risen to her thighs. She stood on the rock, now only ankle-deep in water, and turned back to wave to Conti. Conti looked worried but determined. Using the remaining crutch for support, she eased herself into the water, gasping at the cold. Annie stretched out her hand and Conti grasped it tightly. Together they balanced on the small rock, the river rushing around them. The next rock was barely visible beneath the surface. Annie stepped toward it, feeling with her toes until she found the solid surface. The water rose to her waist, soaking her dress, making each movement a struggle against the weight of wet fabric. One by one, they moved from rock to rock. Sometimes the footing was sure, other times slippery with river moss. Twice they had to wade through sections where they couldn't find solid rocks, the water rising to Annie's chest, forcing Conti to hold her breath as the current momentarily lifted her off her feet. Through it all, they kept their grip on each other, Annie pulling, Conti pushing with her good leg, both of them fighting the persistent tug of the river. They were 3/4 of the way across when disaster nearly struck. Annie stepped forward expecting to find another rock, but her foot plunged into empty water. She lost her balance, falling forward with a splash. The current caught her immediately, pulling her downstream. Conti screamed, still clinging to Annie's hand. For a terrifying moment, they were both being swept away. Then Annie's feet found the river bottom again. She dug her toes into the mud and stones, halting their downward slide. They were in deeper water now, the current stronger, but Annie could just touch the bottom. Conti, being slightly shorter, could not. "Hold on to me," Annie gasped, pulling Conti toward her. With strength born of desperation, Annie fought her way toward shore, half walking, half swimming, dragging Conti with her. Each step was a battle against the current, each breath a victory. Finally, the water began to grow shallow again. Their feet touched stone, then gravel, then mud. With one final effort, they stumbled onto the shore, collapsing onto the rocky beach, soaked and exhausted but alive. They lay there for several minutes, simply breathing, letting the morning sun begin to warm their chilled bodies. They had made it across the river. They were on Conti's side, the Shoshone side. When they had recovered enough strength to sit up, Conti pointed toward a trail leading away from the shore, through a stand of pines in the direction of her village. Annie nodded, understanding. It was time to complete their journey. With her dress dripping and her hair plastered to her face, Annie helped Conti to her feet. The girl's ankle was still tender, but the cold water seemed to have reduced the swelling further. With Annie's shoulder for support, Conti could hop along without the crutch. The trail wound through the trees, climbing gently away from the river. Annie felt a growing nervousness with each step. She was heading into Shoshone territory, a place she had been strictly forbidden to go. What would happen when they reached the village? After walking for about 20 minutes, they emerged from the trees into a small clearing. Conti suddenly stopped, tugging at Annie's arm and pointing. A thin column of smoke rose from behind the next ridge. They were close to the village, but Conti was pointing at something else. Fresh tracks in the soft earth of the trail. Many tracks, both moccasined feet and unshod hooves. People and horses had passed this way recently, heading toward the river. Conti spoke urgently, gesturing first to the tracks, then to herself. Annie understood with a sudden chill. These were searchers looking for Conti. They continued forward more cautiously now. As they crested the ridge, the Shoshone village came into view. It was larger than Annie had imagined. Dozens of hide-covered lodges arranged in a semicircle, with horses corralled nearby and smoke rising from several cooking fires. But the village seemed unusually quiet, with few people visible. Where was everyone? The answer came in a heart-stopping moment as they rounded a bend in the trail. There, at the edge of the village, stood a group of Shoshone men, warriors based on their dress and the weapons they carried. They were gathered as if preparing to depart, likely to continue the search for Conti. One of the men looked up and spotted them. He called out sharply, and suddenly all eyes turned in their direction. Annie froze, her body tensing with fear. For a terrible moment, she thought of running. But Conti still needed her support, and there was nowhere to go. Conti called back in her language, her voice filled with relief and excitement. The warriors stared in disbelief, then several broke into broad smiles. One man, older than the rest with gray streaks in his long hair, pushed forward, his face a mixture of joy and concern. Conti spoke rapidly, gesturing to Annie and then to her injured ankle, clearly explaining what had happened. The older man, her father perhaps, listened intently, his eyes moving from Conti to Annie and back again. Annie stood very still, her heart pounding. She was alone, a settler child in the middle of a Shoshone village. Everything she had been taught told her she should be terrified. Yet as Conti continued her story, pointing to the river and miming their crossing, Annie saw something unexpected in the faces of the watching warriors. Not anger or hostility, but something that looked like respect. When Conti finished speaking, there was a moment of silence. Then the older man stepped forward, looking directly at Annie. His weathered face was solemn, but his eyes were kind. He spoke a few words in the Shoshone language, then placed his hand over his heart and bowed his head slightly. Annie didn't need a translator to understand. It was a gesture of gratitude. She had helped Conti return home. But now Annie realized she had to find her own way back across the river, back to the missionary outpost, back to face whatever consequences awaited her there.